Good evening, Kenya, and welcome to another edition of Perspective 254. My name is Ajeliti Ekesa, and tonight I welcome you with a heavy heart and a mind full of history. The news that has just broken in the last 4 hours has left our nation in a state of collective whiplash. Mr. Raila Odinga, Agwambo, is dead now. To call Mr. Agwambo a towering figure in this context feels very inadequate. Mr. Raila Odinga was our political weather system for over 4 decades. When Mr. Raila Odinga sneezed, Kenya caught a cold. When he roared, the very foundation of this state shook. But how do we process the passing of a man who, in his final years, became one of the most complex and divisive figures in our national consciousness? Mr. Raila Odinga, he was a liberator to some and a traitor to others. And to all of us, he was an enigma. So tonight, we are not here to canonize a saint, nor are we here to demonize a villain. We are here to try and understand the man, the myth, the Agwambo in all his magnificent and frustrating complexity. Now, to understand the grief, we must first of all understand what Mr. Raila Odinga survived. Raila Odinga was forged in the furnace of Daniel Arap Moi's Kenya. The 1980s and 1990s in Kenya were not a time for dissent. But Mr. Raila Odinga, inheriting his father Jaramogi Odinga's rebellious DNA, was a dissenter by nature. His activities led him to one place that was designed to break men: detention. Mr. Raila Odinga was held in several prisons throughout his career during his political detentions, including Kamiti Maximum Prison, Shimo La Tewa, Manyani Prison, and Naivasha Prison. He was held all this time without trial for a total of 9 years throughout the 1980s and early 90s under the authoritarian rule of President Daniel Arap Moi. Now, this was not just a political inconvenience for him. This was a brutal attempt to break and extinguish his political spirit. When he was released, him, alongside other young political firebrands of the day, the likes of James Orengo, Martin Shikuku, and the rest of them, he became the roaring engine for the fight of multi-party democracy in this country. And this is where the legend of Jacom was cemented. He was the people's champion, the storm that planted the forest of our modern democracy. But Raila Odinga's career was never really a straight line. It was basically a zigzag of alliances, so complex it would make the Game of Thrones look like a simple game of checkers or draft. The most iconic moment of his political career came in the year 2002 when Raila Odinga set aside his very own political aspirations in favor of Mwai Kibaki with the famous Kibaki Toshe chant. And with that, a kingmaker was born. With those two words, Raila Odinga anointed Mwai Kibaki and delivered a fatal blow to KANU's 40-year regime. It was a moment of pure political magic. And then, not too long after that, it all started to fall apart. The memorandum of understanding signed between the two of them, between Raila Odinga and Kibaki, was actually ripped up. It was no longer valid. Now, the feeling of betrayal in Mr. Raila Odinga's camp felt deep and very personal. Now, this set the stage for the single most traumatic event in our nation's history, the 2007-2008 post-election violence. After Raila Odinga again lost the 2007 election to Mwai Kibaki, who was hastily sworn in around 7 p.m. on December 30th, just an hour after he had been declared the winner of the election, this country exploded. For two months, Kenya was not a nation. We were killing fields. People were dying left, right, and center, and over 1,200 people died. It was Raila Odinga again who, setting aside his own ambitions, chose to enter into a power-sharing government with the man that he had accused of stealing the election from him. Now, to his supporters, this was a painful but necessary sacrifice that had to be done to stop the bleeding of this nation. To his detractors, though, it was the ultimate sellout. However, from that painful compromise came one of his greatest legacies, the 2010 Constitution. The ultimate paradox, the revolutionary helped build a new system from within the system that he once fought to overthrow. And then came the final and for many the most confusing act of his career. 2018, the great handshake between Raila Odinga and President Uhuru Kenyatta. The man who had once called a thief was now calling him my friend. And this, my fellow Kenyans, is the epicenter of the whole traitor narrative. That's why they call him the traitor. You know, for the young fiery supporters in Kibera, in Kisumu, Mombasa, this was a betrayal of biblical proportions. The revolutionary who built his brand on being the defiant voice against the system had now joined the system. His supporters felt orphaned. The fire that had kept them warm for so many decades had now been extinguished. And in the ultimate irony, this alliance with Uhuru Kenyatta still failed to deliver the 2022 victory to Raila Odinga. Mr. Raila Odinga lost his fifth presidential bid to William Ruto. Now, the Supreme Court that had once saved him had now upheld his defeat, and Raila Odinga was done. But it was his final political act that ultimately broke the camel's back for so many of his diehard supporters. The once fierce critic of William Ruto, the man he had painted as the embodiment of corruption and all that was wrong with the Kenyan politics, shockingly walked across the aisle once more. The sight of Raila Odinga standing shoulder to shoulder with the President Ruto, the very architect of the Tanga Tanga movement that had opposed the handshake, was a final blow that many of his supporters could not comprehend. The man who had built his legacy on principled opposition now appeared to be making alliances with everyone that he once opposed. Now, for his diehard supporters, this was not just a political pragmatism, it was the final surrender of the very principles that they believed he stood for. The pillar of opposition politics had, in his final chapter, become a bridge to the very establishment that he had spent a lifetime fighting. The truth is, we cannot neatly package Mr. Raila Odinga into a single box. He was a giant that walked with a limp of contradiction, a freedom fighter who became a political dealer. For his loyalists, Mr. Raila Odinga is undisputed father of modern democracy in Kenya. They will always remember the detainee, the reformer. They will remember the man whose mere presence at a political rally could electrify a crowd of hundreds of thousands. They will always remember how, even as Prime Minister, Mr. Raila Odinga never stopped being the pillar of opposition, challenging, questioning, and pushing for reform from within the government itself. But for his disillusioned followers, though, he is the leader that abandoned them in the final hour. They will always remember the feeling of revolution postponed. They will always remember the man who once vowed to march to State House, suddenly walking hand in hand with the very person occupying the same State House. They will always remember the final painful memories of their champion standing beside the very political forces that he had spent decades and decades mobilizing them against. Both of these perspectives contain a painful truth. But tonight, as the dust of the shocking news begins to settle on our fractured nation, I want to make one plea. A sad plea, because it comes from a place of recognizing how divided we have become as a nation. Look beyond the final chapter of Mr. Raila Odinga. Try and look beyond the handshake that angered you or the political maneuvers that disappointed you. Look back at the core of what this man, for all his flaws, dedicated his life to before the compromises of age and power set in. This man stood for the idea that no single voice should have a monopoly on power. He stood for the belief that every Kenyan, from whatever community, deserved a seat at the table. Mr. Raila Odinga stood for the courage to challenge authority, to speak truth to power, even when it came at a great personal cost. He stood for the promise of a Kenya where your last name did not determine your destiny. That right there is the legacy. Not the political party, not the final alliances, or whatever it is. It is the unwavering and sometimes misguided pursuit of a more just, more equitable, and more democratic Kenya. So, Whether you loved Mr. Raila Odinga to the very end, or whether you felt betrayed by his final acts, honor him, not by clinging to your anger or grief, but by picking up the baton of what he fought for in his prime. Pursue a Kenya where no one is imprisoned for their political beliefs. Pursue a country where elections are free, fair, and beyond question. Pursue a Kenya where the government is accountable to the people and not the other way around. Now, pursue a Kenya where the sacrifices of the past are not forgotten in the political calculations of the present. This is how we truly, truly mourn a man who was, for better or for worse, the embodiment of our nation's political struggles. We mourn him by refusing to let the ideals that he once championed, the ideals that many of us loved him for, die with him. His long, turbulent race is now run. The rest of the race, and the race for the soul of this nation is now ours. Let us run it with the same kind of fierce love for Kenya that Mr. Raila Odinga, at his very core, he always possessed. And may he, Agwambo, rest in peace. Take care of your minds, and please take care of each other. This has been Perspective 254. Until next time, rest in peace, Agwambo.